Jeffrey was 72 when he first noticed something was wrong. It wasn't a big, dramatic collapse, nothing you'd read about in a medical journal or see in a movie. No, it was something far quieter, far more unsettling. He woke one morning with a heaviness in his body that seemed to cling even after he had rested well through the night. The breakfast he reheated from the day before didn't sit right, leaving his stomach in knots and his energy drained. It was then, in the stillness of his kitchen, that he began to sense that something simple, something ordinary, might be quietly betraying him. He had always prided himself on being practical. Jeffrey grew up in Ohio, worked 35 years as a school principal, and lived by the old saying his father often repeated, "Waste not, want not." Leftovers to him weren't just convenience, they were a mark of good sense and thrift. He would cook on Sundays, carefully portion meals into containers, and then warm them up during the week. It was a habit that carried him through his working years and one that lingered long into retirement. Yet now, in his early 70s, this same habit seemed to leave him more tired, asheer, and strangely foggy. The first real jolt came at his granddaughter's piano recital. He had been looking forward to it for weeks. But as he sat in the auditorium, he noticed his mind wandering, struggling to focus on her tiny hands moving across the keys. His balance felt unsteady when he stood up, as though the ground itself shifted beneath him. Later that evening, he admitted to his wife, Margaret, that he had been feeling this way for a while. The dull ache in his knees after meals, the sudden waves of fatigue, and most troubling of all, the forgetfulness that crept in like an unwelcome guest. For a man who had spent a lifetime leading with sharpness and clarity, this was nothing short of frightening. Doctors ran their tests as they always do, and nothing glaring showed up. Just age, one of them shrugged. The body slows down. But Jeffrey couldn't shake the sense that something else was happening. He knew his body, knew its rhythms. He sensed that the problem wasn't in age itself, but in something he was doing each day, something so routine that he overlooked it entirely. That nagging thought gnawed at him during sleepless nights, when he lay awake listening to the quiet breath of Margaret beside him. It was one chilly morning in March when the realization came. He reheated a plate of spinach and rice, food he thought of as safe, even nourishing. An hour later, his stomach turned sour and the same wave of heaviness pulled at his joints. It was so consistent now that he could almost predict it. The foods he had once trusted were somehow failing him the moment they were reheated. He sat at the kitchen table staring at the fork in his hand and felt a deep mix of betrayal and sorrow. How could something so ordinary, so harmless on the surface, chip away at his strength? Margaret noticed his silence and touched his shoulder. She had seen the man who once carried grocery bags in both arms without effort now hesitate on the stairs. She had seen the man who always remembered birthdays now pause to search for dates on the calendar. "Maybe it's not just the food," she said softly, "but how we're treating it." Her words planted a seed, one Jeffrey carried with him into the weeks that followed. For the first time, he began to question not only what he ate, but how it was prepared, how it changed when heated, cooled, and reheated again. What followed was not a quick transformation, but a slow awakening. Each meal became a test, a quiet experiment. Jeffrey noticed that freshly cooked vegetables felt lighter in his body, while reheated ones left him sluggish. Soups warmed gently on the stove seemed to nourish him differently than meals blasted in the microwave. The patterns were subtle at first, but undeniable. And with each small discovery, he felt as though he was reclaiming pieces of himself, his steadiness, his focus, his independence. There was one afternoon in particular that stays with me. Jeffrey was sitting by the window, watching his granddaughter play in the garden, when he turned to Margaret and said, "I think I've been listening to convenience more than I've been listening to my body." His voice was quiet, tinged with both regret and relief. That was the turning point, the moment he shifted from feeling like a victim of age to a student of his own body. And that small shift, that willingness to look closer, became the beginning of a new kind of strength. What strikes me most about Jeffrey's journey is not that he discovered something hidden in reheated meals. Though that is important, it's that he rediscovered a way of living that demanded presence and care. In every choice, to warm slowly instead of rushing, to cook fresh instead of clinging to old leftovers, he was choosing himself, his clarity, his independence. These were not dramatic medical interventions or miracle cures. They were gentle, daily decisions that restored to him what age alone could not steal. You see, the danger was never in one bite or one meal. It was in the quiet repetition of small habits that eroded him over time. And the healing was found in the equally quiet act of awareness, of listening, of choosing differently. Jeffrey's story reminds us that health is not only about avoiding disease, but about protecting the pieces of life that matter most. The steadiness to walk to your granddaughter's recital, the focus to remember her smile, the strength to feel at home in your own body. That is why I tell you his story, because perhaps, like Jeffrey, you have felt that heaviness, that unexplained fatigue, or that creeping forgetfulness. Perhaps you too have trusted routines that seemed safe, only to realize they no longer serve you. And perhaps it is time, gently and without fear, to look again at the ordinary things, the foods we reheat, the choices we repeat, and ask if they are helping us live or quietly pulling us down. Jeffrey's journey isn't finished, and neither is yours. Each day offers the chance to notice, to adjust, to reclaim what matters most. And in those choices, however small, lies the power to change the story of our health, our independence, and our lives. Jeffrey had always been a man of habit. For more than 40 years, his mornings followed the same script. Wake before sunrise, pour a glass of water with lemon, and warm up yesterday's meal for breakfast. To him, this was not just routine, it was a kind of order that gave his life meaning. He believed in thrift, in making the most of what he had, and in the quiet comfort of knowing each day would begin the same as the last. That belief, inherited from his father who survived the Great Depression, was stitched deep into his bones. But on a cold winter morning, something shifted. Jeffrey sat at the kitchen table, reheating a plate of rice and vegetables from the night before. The microwave hummed, its soft beeping marking another ordinary day. He ate without a second thought, sipping his lemon water like he always did. Yet within the hour, a heaviness settled into his stomach, as if the food itself had turned against him. His joints ached, a dull stiffness spreading through his knees, and his mind felt clouded, unable to focus on the crossword puzzle he once breezed through. It was not the first time this had happened, but for some reason, on that morning, he noticed it in a way he never had before. Margaret, his wife of 50 years, saw the strain on his face. "You don't look right," she said gently, setting her teacup on the counter. Was it the food again? Her words cut through him more than the discomfort in his body. Food had always been a source of comfort in their marriage, the family dinners, the Sunday roasts, the leftover meals they shared during quiet evenings. For her to connect his pain with something as simple as reheating breakfast was unsettling. Jeffrey brushed it off, muttering something about poor sleep, but inside, doubt began to stir. Later that day, when he tried to climb the stairs, his legs resisted. Each step felt heavier than the last. His pride urged him to keep going, to hide the struggle, but Margaret noticed. She always did. "You used to bound up those stairs," she said with a worried smile. The comment stung, not because it was meant to hurt, but because it reminded him of the man he used to be. Steady, capable, in control of his body. That evening, alone in the quiet of their bedroom, he lay awake wondering how something so ordinary, so harmless on the surface, could be stealing his strength piece by piece. The following week only deepened his suspicions. Each time he reheated leftovers for breakfast, the same cycle unfolded. The heaviness, the ache, the fog. But when he ate fresh meals, eggs cooked that morning, oatmeal stirred gently on the stove, the day felt different. His body responded with a lightness he had nearly forgotten. He began to wonder if the problem wasn't the food itself, but the way he treated it. That thought frightened him because it meant questioning a ritual that had carried him through decades, a ritual tied to his identity as a practical, no-nonsense man. One Sunday, after church, his son Matthew dropped by with the grandchildren. As they played in the living room, Jeffrey sat quietly with his coffee. Matthew asked how he was feeling, noticing the stiffness in his father's movements. Jeffrey hesitated, then confessed the truth. "I think my mornings are working against me." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jeffrey explained how the simple act of reheating meals seemed to leave him drained, while fresh foods brought relief. His son listened carefully, nodding. "Dad, maybe your body's trying to tell you something. Maybe it's time to change the routine." The words lingered with Jeffrey long after Matthew left. That night, Margaret suggested something different. "Tomorrow, let's skip the leftovers," she said. "I'll make us something fresh." Jeffrey agreed, though reluctantly. Change did not come easy to him. The next morning, she cooked a small pan of scrambled eggs with spinach. The aroma filled the kitchen, bright and comforting. As Jeffrey ate, he braced himself for the usual heaviness, but instead he felt steady. His stomach was calm, his knees didn't ache as sharply, and his mind was clear enough to finish the crossword. It was a small victory, but one that planted hope where doubt had been growing. Still, he struggled with guilt. Throwing away uneaten food went against everything he believed. Waste was weakness, irresponsibility. He heard his father's voice in his head. A man who wastes food will never know security. That voice haunted him each time he scraped leftovers into the bin. Yet another voice began to rise within him, quieter but persistent, the voice of his own body asking to be heard. He realized that perhaps the true waste was not in discarding food, but in discarding his health for the sake of old habits. The turning point came when he attended his granddaughter's recital. Unlike the last time, when fatigue clouded his focus, he sat upright, alert, watching every note she played. When she glanced up and caught his smile, he felt a swell of pride and relief. Afterwards, she ran into his arms, and he lifted her with ease. The moment was simple, but profound. It was proof that small changes mattered, that listening to his body gave him back pieces of life he thought he had lost. From that day on, Jeffrey made a quiet promise to himself. He would no longer let old routines dictate his health. Each morning, he would choose freshness over convenience, presence over habit. It wasn't about rejecting the past, but about honoring the present, the years he still had, the family who needed him, the life waiting to be lived with clarity and strength. The morning habit that once backfired had become the lesson that guided him toward a new chapter. And as he stood at the sink, rinsing his empty plate, he whispered words that felt like both confession and liberation. "I'm ready to change." Jeffrey never thought twice about leftovers. To him, they were a mark of wisdom, a way of stretching every dollar and every ounce of effort. Growing up, his mother would take Sunday's roast and turn it into sandwiches on Monday, a stew on Tuesday, and a pie by Wednesday. Nothing ever went to waste. That way of life had stayed with him long after he left home, carried into his own kitchen, his own marriage, his own retirement. Leftovers were not just food, they were tradition, proof of care and practicality. But now, in his 70s, the same habit that once felt like security was beginning to feel like a quiet betrayal. He noticed it first in the small ways. A reheated stew that once brought comfort now left him with a knot in his stomach. A plate of microwaved vegetables, still vibrant in color, seemed to rob him of his energy rather than restore it. At first, he dismissed it as age. Bodies change, digestion slows. Perhaps this was just the inevitable toll of time. But when he compared the heaviness of reheated meals with the clarity he felt after freshly cooked ones, he could no longer deny the difference. Something was happening in the way his body responded, and ignoring it only deepened his discomfort. Margaret, ever attentive, began watching closely too. One afternoon, after lunch of reheated rice and chicken, she caught the look on his face as he shifted uneasily in his chair. "It's the same pattern," she said gently. "You eat fresh, you're fine. You eat leftovers, you're not." Jeffrey wanted to argue, to defend the habits he had trusted for decades. But the truth was undeniable. He sighed and rubbed his temples. "I don't understand," he admitted. "Food is food, isn't it?" Margaret shook her head softly. "Maybe not anymore." That night, as they sat by the fireplace, Jeffrey thought back to the words of his doctor. "Sometimes it's not what you eat, but how your body processes it," the man had said during his last checkup. At the time, it felt like a vague reassurance, something doctors say when they don't have answers. But now, it carried new weight. Maybe his body wasn't handling reheated meals the way it once did. Maybe, just maybe, what was harmless at 40 or 50 was no longer harmless at 72. That thought unsettled him because it meant his rules for living might need to change, and change was something Jeffrey never welcomed easily. The real test came during a family gathering. Margaret had prepared a feast the day before, filling the house with the smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and baked carrots. They ate with laughter and joy, but the next day, when the leftovers came out, Jeffrey hesitated. He didn't want to make a fuss, didn't want to dampen the tradition of stretching meals across days. So he took his plate, reheated in the microwave, and ate in silence. Within the hour, his joints ached and his energy drained, the same old story repeating itself. Only this time, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, the weakness felt more humiliating. He watched the kids play in the yard, wishing he had the strength to join them, but all he could do was sink deeper into his chair. Later, when the house grew quiet, Margaret found him staring out the window. "You can't keep ignoring this," she said softly. "It's not about the food, Jeff. It's about you." Her words cut deep because they were true. He realized then that clinging to leftovers wasn't just about thrift or tradition. It was about fear of change, fear of letting go of the habits that had shaped his identity, fear of admitting that his body was no longer the same. And yet, if he kept holding on, he was the one who would suffer most. That recognition sat heavy on his chest. The next morning, he tried something new. Instead of reheating yesterday's casserole, he made a simple bowl of oatmeal with cinnamon and apples. The meal was warm, fresh, and light. As he ate, he felt none of the heaviness, none of the cloud that usually followed. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had outsmarted something that had been quietly undermining him. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was enough to spark hope. Maybe he could adapt. Maybe he could learn to live differently, even at 72. As the days went on, Jeffrey began experimenting. He still cooked larger meals, but instead of saving them for 3 or 4 reheats, he and Margaret froze portions or shared them with neighbors. He noticed that when he did reheat, warming food slowly on the stove felt gentler on his body than the quick blast of the microwave. These small adjustments gave him a sense of control, a feeling that he wasn't simply at the mercy of age. Each choice, though humble, became an act of reclaiming his health. Still, the emotional weight lingered. Throwing away uneaten food felt like betrayal, not just of his father's lessons, but of his own identity. One evening, as he scraped a small portion of wilted vegetables into the bin, he whispered aloud, "I'm sorry, Dad." Margaret, overhearing, walked over and rested a hand on his arm. "Jeff, you're not wasting food. You're saving yourself. Isn't that worth more?" He looked into her eyes and felt something shift. Perhaps honoring his father's wisdom didn't mean clinging to the same practices, but rather carrying forward the deeper lesson, to value what truly sustains you. That realization gave him courage. He began to see that leftovers, while practical, were not harmless, at least not for him anymore. They were a reminder that life is always changing, that what worked yesterday may not serve today. And though it was difficult, he chose to embrace that change, not as a loss, but as a chance to live more fully. The cost of holding on was too high. The gift of letting go was clarity, strength, and the joy of being present with his family. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Jeffrey sat with his granddaughter on the porch swing. She asked him why he didn't eat the same leftovers anymore. He smiled and pulled her close. "Because, sweetheart, sometimes the things we think are safe aren't really safe, and sometimes the best thing we can do is start fresh." She nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the wisdom in his voice. For Jeffrey, it was not just about food anymore. It was about learning, even at 72, that listening to your body is never too late. Jeffrey had begun to accept that not all leftovers were his friends. Some left him drained, aching, foggy, but he was a man of curiosity, and once the idea lodged in his mind, he couldn't let go of it. If some reheated foods weakened him, could others possibly strengthen him? It seemed far-fetched, almost laughable at first, but he wanted to believe it. The thought kept him searching, testing, watching his body's subtle signals with new attention. For the first time in years, Jeffrey wasn't just eating out of routine, he was listening. The experiment began on a cool Wednesday morning. Margaret had made a pot of rice the night before. Normally, he would have avoided reheating it after his recent discoveries, but this time something nudged him. Instead of microwaving, he gently steamed it on the stove, letting the grains warm slowly. He paired it with a fried egg and a sprinkle of herbs from their garden. It was a simple meal, humble even, but as he ate, he noticed something remarkable. An hour later, instead of the familiar fog, his mind felt clear. He sat down to his crossword and filled in answers without hesitation. For the first time in weeks, words came easily, memories surfaced quickly. It was as though a window in his mind had opened. He said nothing to Margaret at first, afraid it might be coincidence, but as the days passed, the pattern repeated. Whenever he ate freshly cooked grains, his body felt light, and when he reheated them gently, particularly rice or potatoes, his memory seemed sharper. "It's the strangest thing," he told Margaret one evening, "but reheated rice actually makes me feel better, not worse." She looked at him with curiosity, then nodded slowly. Maybe not all reheats are bad. Maybe it's about knowing which ones help and which ones hurt. Her words comforted him because they gave permission to explore rather than simply avoid. The discovery gave Jeffrey hope. He had been so afraid that age was stripping away his independence, his mental clarity, the sharpness that once defined him. But here was evidence, however small, that he could still influence the course of his days. That clarity was precious. One afternoon, when his granddaughter asked him to help with her piano practice, he found himself remembering not only the notes she played, but also the songs from his own childhood. He hummed along, much to her delight, and for a moment the years melted away. His mind, though older, still had treasures to share. Margaret noticed too. "You've been sharper lately," she remarked one evening as they played cards at the dining table. "Quicker with your jokes, quicker with your moves." Jeffrey chuckled, though inside he felt something deeper, a swell of gratitude. It wasn't just about memory, it was about connection, about being present with the people he loved. For too long, the fog had stolen that from him. Now, with small changes, he was reclaiming it. And it all began with something as simple as learning which foods could help rather than harm. Still, Jeffrey remained cautious. He didn't want to declare victory too soon. He read quietly in the evenings, flipping through articles Margaret found online. Some hinted at the way starches changed when cooled and reheated, how they might behave differently in the body. The science was complex, but what mattered to Jeffrey was simple: his lived experience. He didn't need textbooks to tell him that certain reheated foods weighed him down while others lifted him up. His body was the truest guide. That realization gave him confidence he hadn't felt in years. One Saturday, they invited neighbors over for supper. Margaret served roasted potatoes, saving a portion for the next day. When they reheated them slowly for breakfast, Jeffrey felt the same clarity he had with rice. "It's not just rice," he said thoughtfully. "Potatoes, too. Some foods give me something back when I warm them again." Margaret smiled, her eyes soft with pride. "Then maybe you found an ally." Jeffrey nodded. For a man who had felt betrayed by his own routines, the idea of food as an ally again was healing. It reminded him that not everything was slipping away. Some things could still surprise him, even bless him. As spring unfolded, so did his new rhythm. He became more deliberate in his choices, more present in his meals. Breakfast was no longer a matter of convenience, but of care. He cooked when he could, reheated only what his body welcomed, and let go of the guilt tied to wasted food. Slowly, he began to see food not as leftover scraps of yesterday, but as a living connection to today, to memory, to focus, to the strength he still carried within him. The change reached beyond his plate. With more clarity, he found himself remembering small details again. The birthdays of friends, the tune of a hymn at church, the exact way his granddaughter liked her hot cocoa. These weren't just memories, they were threads of connection, proof that he was still woven into the lives around him. The fog no longer ruled his mornings, and each clear day felt like a gift he had fought to earn. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Margaret asked, "Do you ever regret discovering all this? That leftovers aren't always what we thought?" Jeffrey shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "I regret not listening sooner. But now I feel like I've been given a second chance." His voice trembled with honesty. For him, the lesson wasn't just about food, it was about attention, about honoring the signals his body had whispered for years. That, more than anything, had changed the course of his days. Looking back, Jeffrey realized that age wasn't just about decline, it was about discovery too. His body, though slower, was still speaking, still teaching him if he cared to listen. Some foods weighed him down, yes, but others, even when reheated, lifted him up, sharpening his memory and restoring his presence. And for Jeffrey, that was enough. Enough to keep learning, enough to keep living with hope, enough to believe that even in his 70s he could shape the story of his own health. That night, as he lay in bed beside Margaret, he whispered a quiet vow. "Tomorrow, I'll keep listening." She squeezed his hand in the dark, and he knew she understood. For them both, the journey was not about perfection, but about presence. And with each small step, each meal, each choice, Jeffrey felt he was not just surviving, but reclaiming life, one clear memory at a time. Jeffrey had grown used to the quiet symphony of his body, the creaks, the stiffness, the way his knees whispered complaints when he climbed stairs. But in recent years, those whispers had turned into a steady murmur, and after certain meals, almost a roar. He first connected the dots after a Sunday dinner. Margaret had served reheated meat left over from the night before, thinking it would be an easy, comforting meal. It smelled wonderful, rich, and familiar. Yet an hour later, Jeffrey found himself pressing his palms against his knees, struggling to stand from his chair. The stiffness wasn't just discomfort anymore, it felt like his very joints were locked in protest. For days, he tried to ignore it. He had always believed joint pain was simply part of aging, an unavoidable companion to his 70s. But when he noticed that the pain flared after certain meals and quieted after others, he couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. He remembered one particular evening when Margaret reheated sausages, a favorite of his since childhood. The flavor was satisfying, reminding him of summer barbecues and family gatherings. Yet the next morning, his knees throbbed so badly that he canceled his morning walk, something he rarely did. It was then he began to wonder if the food itself was pulling the strings of his discomfort. Margaret saw the change in him, the way he hesitated before rising, the way he leaned more heavily on the banister. One evening, as they cleared the dishes, she said softly, "It's worse when you eat certain meats, isn't it?" Jeffrey sighed, reluctant to admit the truth. "I think so," he murmured. "But how do you give up something that's been part of you for so long?" She touched his hand gently. "Maybe it's not about giving it up forever. Maybe it's about listening to what your body is asking for right now." Her words struck him with a mix of sadness and clarity. He realized that holding on to certain foods was like holding on to old routines that no longer served him. They brought comfort in memory, but pain in reality. The turning point came one morning when he tried to rise from bed and felt as though his knees might buckle beneath him. He sat back down, his chest tight with frustration. Margaret found him there, shoulders slumped, eyes clouded with defeat. "This isn't you," she whispered. Jeffrey shook his head. "I can't keep living like this, Margie. If food is doing this to me, I need to face it." That admission, though heavy, felt strangely freeing. For the first time, he acknowledged not just the problem, but his power to change it. In the days that followed, Jeffrey began paying closer attention. He kept a small notebook on the kitchen counter, jotting down what he ate and how his joints felt afterward. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain reheated meats, especially processed ones, left him aching for hours. Fresh fish or gently warmed grains, on the other hand, seemed to leave him lighter. Seeing it written down was sobering. What he had long chalked up to just aging was, at least in part, tied to choices he could control. That realization gave him both relief and responsibility. One evening, Matthew stopped by to help with yard work. As they raked leaves together, Jeffrey shared his discovery. "You know, I think the food I eat has more to do with my joints than I ever believed." His son looked surprised. "Really? I always thought joint pain was just, well, getting older." Jeffrey chuckled softly. "So did I. But I'm learning that some foods stir up more trouble than others. And I can feel the difference." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Dad, maybe that's good news. Means you've still got some control." Jeffrey smiled faintly, the rake pausing in his hands. "That's what I'm starting to see." Margaret supported him in small but meaningful ways. She began serving more fresh meals, experimenting with gentler proteins like lentils and fish. When they did prepare meat, she encouraged him to eat it fresh rather than reheated. At first, Jeffrey missed the convenience of leftovers, the ease of warming a plate in minutes. But as the days passed and the stiffness lessened, the trade-off became clear. Each step without pain felt like a quiet victory, proof that his choices mattered. Still, there were moments of weakness. On one particularly cold night, craving comfort, Jeffrey reheated a plate of beef stew. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, and for a while, he savored every bite. But by the next morning, his knees were swollen, his hands stiff as he tried to lace his shoes. The pain was sharper than he remembered, and with it came regret. "Why do I keep doing this to myself?" he muttered aloud. Margaret, ever patient, reminded him gently, "Because change is hard, but every stumble teaches you something." Her compassion softened his frustration. He realized that even mistakes were part of the learning, part of the shift his life demanded. Over time, Jeffrey found peace in new routines. He still cooked hearty meals, but instead of clinging to leftovers, he shared them with neighbors or froze them for later use. He discovered soups reheated gently on the stove didn't trigger his joints the way reheated meats did. These small victories added up, giving him not just physical relief, but emotional strength. He began walking more again, climbing stairs with greater ease, and even joining his granddaughter for playful chases in the yard. Each moment reminded him of what was at stake, not just his knees, but his ability to live fully, to remain part of the life unfolding around him. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with streaks of orange, Jeffrey sat on the porch, his notebook in hand. He flipped through the pages of meals and notes, tracing the story of his own body with quiet amazement. What once seemed like an unstoppable decline had revealed itself as a dialogue, a conversation between food and flesh, habit and health. He realized that the foods straining his joints weren't just meals, they were lessons, urging him to choose differently, to honor the body that had carried him this far. As Margaret joined him, placing a cup of tea in his hand, Jeffrey spoke softly. "You know, I used to think aging meant losing control, but I see now it's more about learning. Some foods I have to let go of, and that's hard. But what I get in return, the strength to move, the freedom to be myself, it's worth it." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you're not doing it alone." He looked at her, gratitude welling in his chest. For Jeffrey, the journey was no longer just about food or pain. It was about resilience, love, and the courage to keep listening. That night, as he closed his notebook, he whispered to himself, "Not all food is meant to stay with us. Some we release so we can keep walking forward." It was a truth he had earned, one step at a time. Jeffrey had lived with the memory of his father's heart attack for most of his life. He was only 19 when it happened, a bright spring morning that turned suddenly into a day of panic and grief. His father had been strong, hardworking, never one to complain. Yet one meal, one breath, one moment, and his heart gave way. That memory never left Jeffrey, shaping how he viewed his own health. He had always told himself he would outlast those odds, that by eating well and moving often, he could keep his heart strong. But now, in his 70s, with his body whispering warnings and aches and fatigue, the memory pressed closer than ever. One evening, after another round of joint stiffness had settled, Jeffrey sat quietly with Margaret at the table. She noticed the worry in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then spoke. "I've been thinking about my dad and wondering if I'm headed the same way." Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. "You're not your father, Jeff. You're listening in ways he never did. That makes all the difference." Her words soothed him, but deep inside, he knew he had to do more than listen. He had to act. The next morning, Jeffrey stood in the kitchen, staring at the options before him. On one side, the leftover roast from last night, rich and tempting. On the other, a basket of apples and a small carton of oats. For years, he would have reached for the roast without hesitation. But that morning, he thought about his father, about the weight in his chest after heavy meals, about the way his joints had been screaming lately. With a deep breath, he chose the oats. He simmered them slowly, adding slices of apple and a drizzle of honey. It was simple, nourishing, and warm. And as he ate, he felt a quiet steadiness in his body, not the heaviness of meat, but the comfort of food that seemed to support rather than burden him. That day, he noticed something remarkable. His heart, which sometimes felt unsettled after meals, beat steadily. There was no sudden pounding, no strange flutter. His breathing felt easier, his chest lighter. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the difference was undeniable. When Margaret returned from her errands, she found him smiling. "What's got you in such a good mood?" she asked. He lifted the empty bowl and chuckled. "This little thing may have just given me a new lease on life." She laughed, but when he explained, her smile softened into pride. "Sometimes the simplest choices make the biggest difference," she said. Over the next weeks, Jeffrey began to see the power in those small shifts. Instead of reheating heavy meats, he leaned into lighter, fresher meals. Fresh vegetables sautéed gently on the stove, fish warmed slowly with herbs, grains paired with fruits. Each choice, though modest, seemed to ease the strain on his body, especially on his heart. The restless nights where his chest felt heavy and his pulse raced grew fewer. He woke with more energy, able to rise from bed without the dread of what his body might do that day. One afternoon, during a routine checkup, his doctor remarked on the improvement. "Your blood pressure looks better than last visit," he noted, peering over his glasses. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Jeffrey shared only part of the story, that he had been eating lighter, fresher meals. He didn't go into detail about the leftovers or the notebook on the kitchen counter where he tracked his meals and how his body responded. But he smiled to himself, knowing he had begun to shape his health in a way even the doctor hadn't predicted. Still, the journey was not without struggle. Some nights, when family came over, the table would overflow with roasts, casseroles, and comfort foods. The smells tugged at Jeffrey's memories, tempting him to return to old habits. Sometimes he gave in, and the heaviness returned with cruel swiftness. But instead of despair, he learned to see those moments as reminders. His body was teaching him, guiding him toward what it needed. And each time he returned to the simple meals, oats, fresh fruits, gently reheated grains, he felt stronger, steadier, more himself. Margaret became his partner in this new rhythm. She found joy in preparing meals that nourished without burden, experimenting with soups, stews, and salads that left them both feeling lighter. Their kitchen became a place of discovery, not just routine. Sometimes they cooked together, laughing as they tried new combinations, sharing the satisfaction of meals that didn't leave Jeffrey clutching his chest or rubbing his knees. For both of them, it was more than food. It was hope. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the neighborhood, Jeffrey realized how much had changed. A few months earlier, even a short walk left him winded. Now, though still cautious, he moved with ease, his steps steady. He paused under a blooming dogwood tree and looked at Margaret. "Do you know what I feel right now?" he asked. She smiled. "What's that?" "Alive," he said simply, and it was true. The choice of oats over roast, of fresh over reheated, had done more than protect his heart. It had given him back moments like this, walking in the evening light, breathing freely, grateful for each step. As the days turned into weeks, Jeffrey came to see that protecting his heart wasn't about grand changes or impossible diets. It was about respect. Respect for the body that had carried him 72 years. Respect for the signals it sent, the quiet warnings it whispered. Respect for the chance to keep living fully, to watch his granddaughter grow, to sit beside Margaret as the seasons turned. Each bowl of oats, each fresh meal, each choice to listen was a promise he made to himself, a promise to live with intention. One morning, as he spooned apples into his oatmeal, Jeffrey thought of his father. He remembered the strong hands, the booming laugh, the sudden silence that followed his passing. And he whispered softly, "I'm doing it differently, Dad. I'm learning to listen." He knew his father hadn't had the chance to make these choices, to learn these lessons. But Jeffrey did, and in honoring his own body, he felt as though he was honoring his father too, carrying forward not just his memory, but his legacy of resilience. For Jeffrey, the journey was no longer about fear of what might happen. It was about gratitude for what could still be. Each meal was a chance, each day a gift, each heartbeat a reminder that life, even in its later years, was worth protecting. And with every simple choice, the kind that began with something as humble as a bowl of oats, he was writing a new chapter in the story of his heart. Jeffrey had always considered chicken soup the safest of meals. It was the dish his mother made when he was sick as a boy. The pot Margaret simmered on the stove whenever one of the children had a fever. Even now, in his 70s, he thought of it as a comfort, a cure-all, the one food he could trust without question. But trust, he was learning, could be complicated. One evening, after enjoying a bowl of leftover soup reheated from the night before, he discovered that even the safest meals could carry hidden risks. It started subtly. An hour after dinner, as he settled into his armchair with a book, he noticed his stomach rumbling in an unfamiliar way. Soon after, a wave of heaviness spread through him, leaving him tired and irritable. By the next morning, his joints were stiff and his mind foggy, the kind of fog that made it hard to recall even simple details. At first, he refused to believe the soup was the culprit. Chicken soup doesn't hurt anyone, he told himself. But when the same pattern repeated a week later, comfort one evening, discomfort the next, he was forced to face the truth. The safe meal wasn't so safe anymore. Margaret noticed his struggle. "You've been different after the soup," she said gently as they cleaned the kitchen one night. "Maybe it's not the chicken, but the way it's reheated?" Jeffrey frowned, not wanting to admit it. "It's just soup, Margie. We've been eating it for years." She met his eyes with a knowing look. "And your body isn't the same as it was for years. Maybe it's trying to tell you something." Her words lingered in his mind long after he went to bed. It was painful to accept that even traditions could turn against him, but ignoring it no longer felt like an option. The realization came fully one Saturday afternoon. Their granddaughter Emma was visiting, and she begged for Grandpa's chicken soup, the recipe he had learned from his mother and passed down through the family. With joy, Jeffrey cooked a big pot, filling the house with its familiar aroma. That evening, they all sat around the table, sharing laughter and second helpings. But the next day, when only the leftovers remained, Jeffrey reheated a bowl for himself. He expected the same warmth and comfort. Instead, his stomach churned, his knees swelled, and his energy plummeted. Watching Emma play in the yard later, he felt like an observer rather than a participant, trapped by his body's fatigue. The disappointment cut deep. The soup he had once trusted to bring him closer to family now seemed to pull him further away. That night, he confessed his frustration to Margaret. "It feels like betrayal," he said quietly. "Even the good things turn against me now." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not betrayal, Jeff. Just change. Maybe the lesson isn't that the soup is bad, but that it has to be different." He considered her words, remembering how fresh meals had treated him more kindly. Maybe it wasn't about abandoning the dish, but about respecting the way it changed with time, both the soup and his own body. In the weeks that followed, Jeffrey began experimenting. Instead of reheating the soup in the microwave, he simmered it gently on the stove, adding fresh vegetables to renew it. The results were better, not perfect, but kinder to his body. He also learned to freeze portions right after cooking, reheating only once instead of letting them sit in the fridge for days. These small adjustments made a difference. The soup, once toxic in its leftover state, became nourishing again when treated with more care. It was a revelation. The safe meal hadn't turned against him. He had simply failed to adapt with it. The experience taught Jeffrey something deeper than food. He realized how often in life we cling to what once worked, blind to the ways time reshapes it. Chicken soup was a symbol of comfort, but comfort could change. His body, once resilient to anything, now required gentler rhythms, and perhaps that wasn't loss, but wisdom, a call to pay attention, to live more deliberately. The thought gave him peace. Instead of mourning what was gone, he began to see the gift of awareness that age had given him. One evening, as he and Margaret shared a bowl of freshly simmered soup, he spoke softly. "You know, I used to think strength meant never changing, holding on no matter what. But maybe strength is learning when to let go, when to adjust." Margaret smiled, her eyes glimmering. "That's the kind of strength that keeps you alive." He nodded, realizing she was right. The soup hadn't betrayed him. It had simply taught him that safety lies not in tradition, but in adaptability. The next time Emma came over, Jeffrey made the soup again, but with a twist. He served it fresh, savoring it alongside his family, with no leftovers to tempt him the next day. As he watched Emma slurp happily from her bowl, he felt relief. The dish still carried its warmth, its tradition, its memory, but now it was on his terms, shaped by the wisdom of experience. He no longer feared it because he had learned how to honor it and himself. From that day forward, Jeffrey carried the lesson into other parts of his life. He became more cautious about what he called safe. He realized that safety wasn't fixed, that even the most trusted routines could shift over time. And far from being discouraging, this gave him hope, because it meant he wasn't powerless. He could adjust, adapt, and continue to live fully, even in the face of change. Each bowl of soup, each small choice became a reminder that life was still his to shape. As the seasons changed, Jeffrey often thought back to those nights of discomfort, the heaviness that once followed his safe meals. They had felt like endings at the time, signals that his body was slipping away. But now, with his newfound awareness, he saw them as beginnings, the first steps on a journey of listening, learning, and reclaiming. He no longer feared the betrayal of food. Instead, he trusted in his ability to respond, to meet change with wisdom and care. That night, as he placed the last spoon in the dishwasher, he smiled and said quietly to himself, "Safe isn't always safe, but it can be if you're willing to see it differently." It was a truth he had earned not just with his mind, but with his body, and it carried him forward with quiet courage. Jeffrey had never thought about food beyond whether it tasted good and filled him up. In his younger years, nutrients were something he heard about in passing, usually from doctors or the occasional article Margaret clipped out of a magazine. But he never connected them to his daily meals. Food was food, he thought, and the body knew what to do with it. Yet as his body changed in his 70s, he began to see things differently. Meals that once left him energized now seemed to leave him flat, and no amount of sleep or rest seemed to restore what had been lost. It was Margaret who first suggested the possibility he hadn't considered. "Maybe it's not the food itself, Jeff, but what happens to it when we heat it up." Her words struck him on a quiet Tuesday morning. He had warmed up a plate of spinach and carrots from the night before, thinking he was making a healthy choice. But after eating, he felt drained, his muscles oddly weak. Later that day, while flipping through the crossword puzzle, he realized his focus had slipped again. He remembered Margaret's words, and for the first time, he wondered if the nutrients he thought he was giving his body had somehow been lost in the process. The thought stayed with him, and that evening he searched the memory of his body like a detective. He remembered the times he ate vegetables, freshly steamed or lightly sautéed. His body felt sharper then, steadier. But when those same vegetables were left to cool and reheated later, the effect was different. His energy seemed to fade rather than flourish. "It's like the food forgets how to help me once it's heated again," he murmured to Margaret. She gave a small, sympathetic smile. "Or maybe our bodies forget how to take what they need once we change it too much." The turning point came during a visit with his doctor. Jeffrey mentioned, almost in passing, how some meals seemed to sap his energy while others restored it. The doctor leaned back thoughtfully. "Your body may not be absorbing nutrients the same way it used to," he explained. "And yes, the way food is cooked or reheated can change what you get from it. Vitamins like C, for example, are fragile. Heat them too much, and they're gone." The explanation was simple, but it landed heavily with Jeffrey. He realized that his choices in the kitchen weren't just about flavor or convenience. They were about whether his body received the strength it needed to keep going. From that day, he began experimenting. He tried eating salads more often, raw carrots and fresh fruit in the mornings, and noticed a distinct difference in his energy. He still enjoyed warm meals, but he became careful with how they were prepared. Instead of reheating vegetables until they wilted, he gently warmed them, or better yet, prepared them fresh. The changes were subtle at first, but undeniable. His afternoons grew lighter, his walks steadier, his mind less foggy. It was as if his body was quietly thanking him for protecting the very nutrients that kept it alive. Margaret noticed too. "You've been brighter lately," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Quicker with your jokes, sharper with your stories." Jeffrey chuckled, though his heart swelled with gratitude. For him, this wasn't just about health, it was about reclaiming himself, the man who had once been quick-witted and full of energy, the man his grandchildren adored. He realized that the nutrients in his meals weren't abstract ideas, they were threads that tied him to the life he still wanted to live. One afternoon, while preparing lunch, Emma wandered into the kitchen. "Grandpa, why are you cutting up all those raw vegetables? Don't you want them cooked?" Jeffrey smiled and handed her a piece of fresh cucumber. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the best way to get what we need is to keep it simple." She crunched happily, her eyes wide with delight. That moment, small as it was, reminded Jeffrey of the power of passing on not just recipes, but lessons. He wanted his grandchildren to grow up knowing that food wasn't just about filling a plate, but about fueling the moments that mattered most. Still, there were temptations. On cold evenings, he longed for the comfort of reheated stews or casseroles. Sometimes he indulged, and sometimes the fatigue returned. But instead of frustration, he chose to see it as his body's way of teaching him. Each ache, each foggy moment was not punishment, but a reminder. He began to view his meals as a kind of conversation. If he listened closely, his body would always answer. The shift brought unexpected peace. He no longer felt betrayed by food as he once had. Instead, he saw it as a partner, one that required care and attention. By respecting the nutrients, by protecting them through gentler cooking and mindful reheating, he was protecting himself. Each fresh salad, each lightly warmed dish became a quiet act of devotion, not just to his body, but to the life he wanted to keep living. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of gold, Jeffrey sat on the porch with Margaret. "You know," he said, gazing at the horizon, "I used to think aging was about losing, but it feels more like learning to notice, learning to adapt." Margaret squeezed his hand. "And you're better for it." He nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. For Jeffrey, the discovery that heat could destroy what he needed wasn't a loss at all. It was an invitation to live more attentively, to savor the fresh and the fragile, to see each meal as a gift worth protecting. That night, as he prepared a simple plate of fresh fruit before bed, he whispered to himself, "Not all strength comes from what we keep. Sometimes it comes from what we preserve." And with that, he smiled, ready to greet another day with the clarity his body had been waiting for all along. Jeffrey always had a soft spot for casseroles. They reminded him of home, of Sunday evenings when neighbors would bring dishes to share, and the whole street seemed to gather around one table. For decades, casseroles had been his definition of comfort food, warm, filling, and endlessly versatile. Margaret often baked one on chilly nights, filling the house with the smell of cheese and spices, the kind of aroma that seemed to wrap the family in a blanket of memory. To Jeffrey, a casserole was more than a meal. It was nostalgia, a reminder of times when life felt safe and simple. But lately, nostalgia was coming with a cost. One evening, Margaret reheated a casserole they had enjoyed the night before. It was rich with pasta, cheese, and a creamy sauce. Jeffrey ate with his usual enthusiasm, savoring each bite, but within an hour, his body pushed back. His hands swelled, his knees burned with an ache that spread through his joints like a quiet fire. By morning, his fingers were so stiff that even buttoning his shirt felt like a challenge. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, frustration tightening his chest. How could something that had always brought joy now bring such pain? At first, he resisted the connection. Surely it's just age, he thought. Everyone his age had some joint pain, but deep down, he knew better. He remembered the days he ate lighter meals, fresh vegetables, gently warmed grains, and how his body responded with calm. The casseroles, with their reheated sauces and processed ingredients, left him in a very different place. "I think the food is fueling the fire," he admitted one morning to Margaret, his voice heavy with reluctance. She nodded slowly, already suspecting the truth. "Comfort doesn't always mean kindness, Jeff," she said softly. The realization hit hardest at a family gathering. Margaret had prepared a large casserole, rich and bubbling, for their children and grandchildren. Jeffrey ate heartily, swept up in the joy of laughter and stories. But by the time everyone left, his joints screamed with pain. He couldn't hide it. Even Emma noticed, asking, "Grandpa, why do you walk funny?" Her innocent words pierced him. That night, as he sat with Margaret by the dim glow of the kitchen light, he confessed, "I can't keep doing this. I don't want them to remember me like that," hunched over, wincing with every step. The next day, he took out his notebook and wrote, "Casserole, sakir fire." It was a simple phrase, but it captured what he felt. Each time he indulged, the inflammation flared, reminding him that comfort could carry hidden costs. It wasn't just physical pain, it was emotional too. The more he hurt, the less he participated, in games, in walks, in family moments. The food he thought was connecting him to loved ones was, in fact, pulling him away. Margaret, ever supportive, began rethinking how they prepared their meals. Instead of heavy casseroles reheated in the oven, she experimented with lighter versions. Fresh vegetables roasted with olive oil, baked fish with herbs, warm stews rich in spices but not cream. At first, Jeffrey missed the gooey cheese, the creamy sauces, but as the days passed, his joints calmed, his mornings grew easier, and he realized that what he had gained far outweighed what he had lost. Comfort, he discovered, could be redefined. Still, the temptation lingered. On one particularly cold evening, after a long day, Jeffrey craved the old warmth of a cheesy casserole. Margaret hesitated but agreed. They shared it, laughing at their indulgence. The next morning, however, his hands swelled again, and the ache returned with full force. Instead of despair, Jeffrey felt clarity. "The body doesn't lie," he said aloud, scribbling in his notebook. "It remembers what we forget." That pain, though sharp, reinforced his resolve. He realized he didn't have to deny himself completely, but he had to respect his limits. One afternoon, he spoke with his doctor about the flare-ups. The doctor nodded knowingly. Inflammation can be tricky. It often builds quietly until something pushes it over the edge. Foods heavy in processed fats, reheated oils, or rich sauces can fuel that fire. The words echoed Jeffrey's own observations. He left the office feeling validated, more certain than ever that his choices mattered. The doctor didn't prescribe new pills or complicated treatments. He simply encouraged Jeffrey to keep listening to his body. And that, more than anything, gave him a sense of control. The real victory came weeks later. At another family gathering, Margaret prepared a spread of lighter dishes instead of a heavy casserole. Fresh salads, roasted vegetables, and a pot of gently simmered soup filled the table. At first, Jeffrey worried the family might miss the old traditions, but to his surprise, the laughter flowed, the plates emptied, and no one complained. Later that night, his joints remained calm, and he joined the grandchildren for a short walk under the stars. It was proof that connection didn't depend on casseroles. It depended on presence, and he could only be present when his body wasn't battling pain. One evening, as he sat by the fire, Jeffrey reflected on how much he had learned. Comfort used to mean food that filled me up, he told Margaret. Now it means food that lets me keep moving, keep living. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Maybe that's the best comfort of all. He realized then that true comfort wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about choosing what allowed him to stay fully alive in the present. As spring bloomed outside their windows, Jeffrey began to see casseroles differently. Not as enemies, not as betrayals, but as teachers. They had shown him the hidden link between comfort and pain, tradition and inflammation. And through them, he had discovered a deeper truth, that even the most cherished dishes could change, and that letting them go, or reshaping them, was not weakness but wisdom. That night, as he wrote in his notebook, he paused, pen hovering. Then he wrote, "True comfort is the kind that lets me hold my granddaughter without pain." And with that, he closed the book, smiling softly. He knew he was no longer fighting against his body. He was walking with it, step by step, toward a life of gentler comforts, free from the fire that once held him back. Jeffrey had always accepted fatigue as part of getting older. "It comes with the territory," he would joke to his son, Matthew, when he needed to sit down after mowing only half the lawn. But deep inside, the fatigue worried him. It wasn't just being tired after activity, it was a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that crept up on him even after simple meals. He would eat, sit in his chair, and within an hour feel as though a heavy blanket had been draped over his entire body. The more it happened, the more it scared him. He began to wonder if fatigue wasn't simply age, but a sign that something he was doing, perhaps something as ordinary as what he ate, was quietly working against him. One morning, after reheating a plate of pasta from the night before, he felt the weight descend once again. His eyelids drooped, his mind dulled, and by mid-morning he was napping in his chair. When he woke, he felt no more refreshed than before, only frustrated. Margaret noticed and said gently, "You've been more tired after certain meals. Do you think it could be the food?" Jeffrey frowned, reluctant to admit it. Food's supposed to give us energy, not take it away. But the truth of her words gnawed at him. He remembered how much clearer he felt after fresh breakfasts, oats, fruit, or eggs, compared to the fog that followed reheated pasta or casseroles. The turning point came when Emma asked him to play outside one afternoon. He wanted to say yes, but his body betrayed him. His legs felt heavy, his chest sluggish, his energy gone. He forced a smile and told her, "Maybe later, sweetheart." But as he watched her play from the porch, his heart ached. It wasn't just fatigue anymore, it was missed moments, missed laughter, missed memories. That evening, as he sat with Margaret, he admitted quietly, "I'm tired of being tired. I don't want this to be the way I spend the rest of my days." Determined, Jeffrey began to track his fatigue. He wrote down not only what he ate, but how long it took before the heaviness came. Patterns emerged quickly. Meals heavy in reheated starches, creamy sauces, or processed foods left him sluggish within an hour. Fresh vegetables, lighter proteins, and fruits gave him steadier energy. Seeing it on paper confirmed what his body had been whispering all along. "It's the food," he told Margaret one morning, tapping his notebook. "It's not just age, it's the food." Margaret embraced the discovery with him. Together they began experimenting. Smaller portions, fresher meals, less reliance on reheated heavy dishes. At first, Jeffrey was skeptical. Could something so simple really change the fatigue that had haunted him for years? But slowly he began to notice the difference. Instead of collapsing into naps after lunch, he had the energy to walk with Margaret in the garden. Instead of nodding off in his chair during Emma's visits, he stayed alert enough to join her games. Each small victory gave him back pieces of his life. One afternoon, as he played checkers with Emma, she looked up and said, "You don't seem so sleepy anymore, Grandpa." The words, innocent and true, filled him with pride. He realized that fatigue had stolen more from him than he'd realized, not just energy, but presence. By listening to his body and changing his habits, he was reclaiming those moments. The joy of hearing his granddaughter laugh, the satisfaction of finishing a walk without gasping, the peace of sitting by the fire without nodding off, these became his new measure of success. But the journey wasn't perfect. There were still days when he slipped, when convenience lured him back to leftovers heavy with pasta or potatoes. And when the fatigue returned, it was sharp, almost punishing. Yet even those moments served a purpose. They reminded him of the stakes, of what was at risk if he ignored the lessons his body had worked so hard to teach. Instead of despair, he chose gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to notice, to adjust, to do better the next day. One evening, Matthew visited and asked how he had been feeling. Jeffrey shared his discoveries about fatigue and food. His son listened, nodding. "Dad, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe the body doesn't have as much room for error as it used to, but look at you, you're figuring it out." Jeffrey smiled, a spark of pride warming him. He wasn't just enduring age, he was learning, adapting, living with intention. That knowledge gave him more strength than any nap ever could. As summer arrived, Jeffrey found himself with new energy for old joys. He tended to the garden more often, pulling weeds and planting flowers. He took longer walks with Margaret, pausing only to breathe in the scent of blooming roses. He even surprised himself one evening by dancing with her in the kitchen as the radio played an old tune. Margaret laughed in delight, her eyes shining. "Where did all this energy come from?" she asked. Jeffrey kissed her cheek. "From finally listening," he said simply. The lesson was clear. Fatigue wasn't just age, it was a message, a signal that his body needed different fuel. And by honoring that message, he had given himself more than energy. He had given himself life, not just longer days, but better ones. The hidden trigger wasn't a curse, but a teacher, guiding him toward choices that allowed him to live fully, even in his 70s. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sun sink below the horizon, Jeffrey whispered to himself, "Tired isn't who I am. It's just what happens when I forget to listen." With that, he leaned back, his body steady, his heart full, and his spirit ready for the moments still ahead. Jeffrey had always prided himself on having what he called an iron stomach. Back in his 40s and 50s, he could eat just about anything, spicy chili, greasy diner food, reheated leftovers, and feel no worse for it. He often teased his friends who complained of indigestion. "It's all in your head," he would say with a grin, patting his stomach as if it were made of steel. But now in his 70s, that confidence had slipped away. More and more often, meals left him with a sour heaviness in his belly, as if his body no longer had the strength to process what used to be second nature. The shift became undeniable one afternoon after lunch. Margaret had reheated a plate of vegetables and pasta from the night before, thinking it was a light, easy meal. Within an hour, Jeffrey felt bloated, his stomach groaning with discomfort. He sat in his chair, rubbing his belly, unable to focus on the crossword puzzle in front of him. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, concerned. He shook his head, embarrassed. "It's this stomach of mine. It's not what it used to be." He paused, then added softly, "It seems worse after reheated food." Saying it aloud felt strange, almost shameful, as though admitting weakness. That evening, when the discomfort lingered, Jeffrey began to reflect. He realized it wasn't just this one meal. Time and again, reheated food seemed to sit heavily in him, while fresh meals felt easier, cleaner. He remembered the mornings when he ate oatmeal with fruit. No discomfort, no bloating. But the evenings of reheated casseroles or stews often ended with him sitting uncomfortably in his chair, regretting the choice. It wasn't simply age, he began to suspect. It was the way food changed when it was cooked, cooled, and heated again. The turning point came during a visit with his doctor. Jeffrey described the bloating, the heaviness, the way his body seemed to resist certain meals. The doctor listened carefully and said, "As we age, our digestive systems become more sensitive. Reheating certain foods can change their structure in ways that make them harder to break down. Your stomach simply doesn't have the same tools it once did." The explanation, though clinical, gave Jeffrey clarity. He wasn't imagining things. His body wasn't betraying him without reason. It was adapting, asking him to do the same. That night, Jeffrey shared what he had learned with Margaret. "It's not just in my head," he told her. "My stomach really can't handle some of these reheated meals anymore." Margaret nodded. "Then we'll find another way. We'll make food that's gentler, easier." Her calm acceptance lifted a weight off his shoulders. For so long, he had felt ashamed of the discomfort, as if it were weakness. But now, he saw it differently. It was simply part of the journey, another lesson in listening to his body. From then on, Jeffrey began paying closer attention. He avoided reheating foods that left him bloated, creamy sauces, oily casseroles, pasta dishes. Instead, he focused on fresh meals or gently warmed soups and grains. The difference was profound. His belly felt lighter, his energy steadier, his evenings calmer. The nights of sitting uncomfortably in his chair grew fewer, replaced by evenings of reading or playing cards with Margaret without distraction. The simple act of listening had given him back a measure of peace. Still, old habits tugged at him. On one particularly busy day, too tired to cook, he reheated a plate of pasta. Within the hour, the heaviness returned, his stomach tight and swollen. But instead of despair, Jeffrey took it as confirmation. "The body doesn't lie," he said aloud, jotting the meal into his notebook. "It tells us what it can and can't handle." The discomfort was frustrating, yes, but it no longer frightened him. It was simply part of the dialogue, a reminder of the choices that mattered. Margaret became his partner in finding gentler meals. Together, they experimented with simple soups, steamed vegetables, and lightly cooked fish. They discovered that some foods, when reheated carefully on the stove, were still kind to his stomach, while others, especially rich or starchy dishes, were best avoided. The kitchen became a place of discovery rather than frustration, each meal an experiment in finding what truly nourished him. Slowly, Jeffrey came to see digestion not as a battle but as a conversation, one he could enter with patience and care. One afternoon, Emma asked him why he didn't eat leftovers as often anymore. Jeffrey smiled, pulling her onto his lap. "Because, sweetheart, my stomach is like a tired old engine. It runs better when the fuel is fresh." She giggled at the comparison, then nodded as though she understood. For Jeffrey, the moment was more than just an explanation. It was a chance to pass on a lesson that listening to your body is not weakness, but wisdom. Over time, Jeffrey began to see the bigger picture. His digestion wasn't just about food, it was about life itself. The heaviness that came after reheated meals mirrored the heaviness he felt when clinging to old habits that no longer served him. The lightness that followed fresh meals mirrored the freedom he felt when he embraced change. Food had become a metaphor, teaching him that life, like digestion, requires adaptation, gentleness, and respect. One evening, as he and Margaret shared a bowl of freshly made soup, he said softly, "You know, I used to think my stomach was failing me, but really, it's just teaching me to slow down, to pay attention." Margaret smiled, her eyes warm. "And maybe that's the lesson we all need, to pay attention." Jeffrey nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. His digestion, once a source of frustration, had become a guide, leading him toward a life of greater care and awareness. That night, as he rinsed the bowls and set them in the sink, Jeffrey whispered to himself, "Fresh fuel for a steady engine." It was a simple phrase, but it captured the truth he had earned. Digestion, like life, worked best when treated with gentleness. And by honoring that truth, he had given himself not just relief from discomfort, but the strength to keep moving forward with clarity and grace. Jeffrey had grown used to the fog that sometimes clouded his mind. It wasn't that he forgot names or lost track of where he was, not yet, but there were moments when his thoughts felt slower, less sharp. The crossword puzzles he once finished before lunch now stretched across the day. Sometimes he lost his place in the middle of a book and had to reread whole pages. At first, he told himself this was normal, just another part of aging, but deep down, the fog frightened him. More than the aches in his knees, more than the stiffness in his back, he feared losing the clarity that had always defined him. It was Margaret who first noticed the difference. "You've been quieter lately," she said one evening as they cleared the dinner table. "Not as quick with your stories." Jeffrey sighed, reluctant to admit what he felt. "My mind just feels heavy sometimes, like it's moving through mud." Saying it aloud made the fear sharper, more real. Margaret squeezed his hand. "Then let's find a way to clear it." The turning point came one morning in the simplest of ways. Margaret had made a small bowl of blueberries to go with their breakfast oats. Jeffrey ate them absent-mindedly, not expecting much. But as the morning went on, he noticed a difference. His thoughts seemed clearer, his focus sharper. He tackled his crossword with unusual ease, recalling words that had eluded him for days. By the time Margaret returned from her errands, she found him humming, pen moving briskly across the page. "Well, look at you," she said with a smile. Jeffrey looked up, surprised by his own energy. "It's the strangest thing," he admitted. "I feel sharper today." At first, he thought it was coincidence, but the next time Margaret brought home a fresh basket of blueberries, the same thing happened. Each morning he ate them, his mind seemed lighter, clearer, more alive. He remembered small details, the birthdays of old friends, the lyrics to songs from his youth, the exact shade of blue in the sky when he was a boy. It was as though the berries were unlocking something hidden in him, giving him back pieces of himself he thought were gone. Intrigued, Jeffrey began to make them part of his daily routine. A handful with breakfast, sometimes another in the afternoon. The effect was subtle but steady. He didn't feel like a different man, but he felt more like himself. The self who had once been quick with jokes, sharp with memory, engaged with life. "It's just fruit," he said one evening, marveling at the change. Margaret smiled knowingly. Sometimes the simplest things hold the biggest gifts. The difference showed in the smallest but most precious ways. During Emma's piano practice, he found himself remembering the melodies and humming along. When Matthew visited, Jeffrey recalled stories from his son's childhood without hesitation, stories that had been fuzzy only weeks before. Even Margaret noticed during their evening card games. "You're quicker again," she teased, laughing when he beat her 2 hands in a row. Jeffrey laughed too, but inside he felt something deeper, gratitude. Each berry was not just food, but a thread pulling him back to the clarity he feared losing. Of course, not every day was perfect. There were still mornings when the fog returned, still evenings when his mind felt tired. But the difference was clear enough that Jeffrey no longer felt powerless. He realized that food, in its quiet way, could either weigh him down or lift him up. The blueberries had become a symbol of hope, proof that even small choices could make a profound difference. One afternoon, Jeffrey brought a bowl of berries out to the porch and sat with Emma. She popped them into her mouth one by one, giggling at the purple stains on her fingers. "Why do you eat these so much, Grandpa?" she asked. Jeffrey smiled, looking at her with affection. "Because they help me remember. They help me stay sharp so I don't forget the things that matter, like your laugh." Emma beamed, and for Jeffrey, that was reason enough to keep eating them. The discovery also reshaped how he saw aging. He had always thought of it as a slow decline, a steady slipping away of abilities. But now he saw it differently. Aging, he realized, could also be about discovering new allies, small supports that helped him continue forward. His body wasn't giving up, it was asking for help in new ways, and the blueberries, in their quiet simplicity, were one of those helpers. Margaret shared in his joy. She began to weave more of them into their meals, stirred into yogurt, sprinkled over salads, even baked into a pie for special occasions. Each time, Jeffrey smiled, savoring not just the flavor but the clarity that followed. The berries became more than food, they became a ritual, a daily act of hope. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Jeffrey turned to Margaret. "You know, I used to think losing my sharpness was inevitable, but now I see it's not about stopping the clock, it's about listening, making choices that keep me alive in the ways that matter." Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "And you're doing it, Jeff, one day at a time." That night, as he set the empty bowl in the sink, Jeffrey whispered softly, "A handful of clarity, one berry at a time." The words felt true, earned through experience. He no longer feared the fog as he once had, because now he knew he had tools, choices, and hope, and that was enough to keep him moving forward with focus and grace. Jeffrey had always associated warmth with comfort. A bowl of soup on a cold day, a cup of tea after supper, the gentle embrace of Margaret's hands when she held his. All of it reminded him that warmth was more than a sensation. It was a kind of medicine for the soul. Yet he had never thought of warmth in food as anything more than preference. Hot meals simply tasted better, felt better. But one winter morning, he began to see that warmth wasn't just comfort, it was healing. He had been feeling particularly stiff that week. His knees tight, his back sore. The cold seemed to sink into his bones more deeply than it once had. That morning, Margaret suggested oatmeal, simmered on the stove with cinnamon and sliced apples. As Jeffrey spooned the steaming porridge into his mouth, he felt a surprising wave of relief. The warmth spread from his stomach outward, loosening the tension in his joints, calming the unease in his belly. By the time he finished, he felt lighter, clearer, even energized. "Strange," he said, almost to himself. "It feels like the heat itself is helping me." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Maybe it is," she said. "Your body's not just asking for food anymore, Jeff. It's asking for care." He thought about that all morning, and the more he considered it, the more sense it made. Cold meals, like sandwiches or leftover pasta straight from the fridge, always seemed to sit heavily in him, as though his body had to work harder just to catch up. But warm meals, soups, teas, gently heated grains felt like they were meeting his body halfway, easing its burden, offering strength. The realization deepened later that week when he skipped supper and grabbed a cold snack instead. That night, he lay in bed, restless, his stomach unsettled, his thoughts clouded. The next evening, Margaret made a pot of vegetable soup, and the difference was remarkable. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth, and afterward, he felt calm, steady, ready for rest. "There's something to this," he told her. "It's not just food, it's the warmth itself." Margaret nodded, her eyes soft. Sometimes healing is as simple as temperature. The discovery changed the way Jeffrey approached his meals. He began to see warmth not as luxury but as medicine. Morning tea became a ritual, not just for taste, but for the way it soothed his digestion. Warm broths became his evening companions, calming his joints and easing the fatigue that often followed him through the day. Even reheated rice, gently steamed, seemed to offer a clarity and steadiness that cold foods never did. He realized his body no longer craved the convenience of quick bites, it craved the gentle embrace of warmth. It wasn't just physical. Warmth brought emotional healing too. One evening, as he and Margaret sat by the fire sipping tea, Jeffrey confessed, "I used to think strength meant never needing help, but maybe strength is choosing what helps, even in the small things." Margaret leaned against him, her smile quiet and knowing. That's the kind of strength that keeps us alive. He realized then that warmth was more than temperature. It was presence, the presence of care, of attention, of choosing gentleness over neglect. The impact was visible to his family. When Matthew visited, he noticed his father moving more easily, his energy steadier. "You've been doing better lately, Dad," he said with a smile. Jeffrey chuckled. "Turns out, warmth does more than comfort, it heals." Matthew laughed, thinking his father was joking, but Jeffrey's eyes told a different story. It wasn't a joke, it was truth earned through quiet discovery. Even Emma noticed. One afternoon, she joined Jeffrey for tea. "Why do you always drink this, Grandpa?" she asked, cradling her warm mug with both hands. Jeffrey smiled. "Because it makes me feel cared for, by the tea, by myself, by everyone around me." Emma considered this, then nodded thoughtfully. "I think it cares for me too." Jeffrey laughed, but deep inside, he felt a swell of pride. If he could pass on one lesson, it would be this, that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures, but often in small, warm moments. As the weeks passed, Jeffrey became more deliberate. He avoided cold leftovers, choosing instead to gently warm what he ate. He let go of the guilt that once came with reheating certain meals, realizing that warmth, when done with care, could transform food from burden to blessing. The fog in his mind lifted more often, his joints protested less, and his evenings grew calmer. It wasn't perfection, there were still days of pain, still moments of fatigue, but there was progress, and that progress gave him hope. One night, as he wrote in his notebook, Jeffrey paused to reflect. "Warmth heals," he scribbled, "not just food, but life itself." He thought of the warmth of Margaret's hand in his, the warmth of Emma's laughter, the warmth of a meal that eased rather than burdened. These weren't small comforts anymore. They were lifelines, anchors that held him steady in the shifting tides of age. Later, as he and Margaret prepared for bed, he whispered, "You know, I think I've been underestimating the simple things." Margaret smiled, pulling the quilt up around them. The simple things are often the most powerful. Jeffrey nodded, letting the warmth of her words and the quilt wrap around him. He fell asleep with a calmness he hadn't known in years, grateful for the quiet lesson hidden in something as ordinary as a bowl of soup. Jeffrey had always thought energy was a matter of sleep and age. If you were young, you had plenty of it. If you were old, you didn't. It seemed simple enough. But in his 70s, he began to notice something that unsettled him. There were days when he woke rested, full of potential, only to feel utterly drained by mid-morning. The exhaustion didn't make sense. He hadn't done anything strenuous. He hadn't slept poorly. It was as if some invisible hand reached inside and pulled the strength right out of him. At first, he blamed himself. "Maybe I'm just slowing down," he muttered one morning, watching the steam curl from his tea. But Margaret, who had been quietly observing, shook her head. "It's not just age, Jeff. It's something else. You're fine some mornings and then others. It's like the life drains out of you." Her words struck him because deep down he knew she was right. It wasn't random. Something was triggering the drain, and if he could find it, maybe he could change it. The breakthrough came one afternoon after lunch. Jeffrey had reheated a creamy pasta dish, rich and filling. Within an hour, he felt it. The weight, the fog, the deep exhaustion that seemed to press him into his chair. His body felt heavy, his mind dull, as though he were carrying invisible chains. He dozed off for nearly 2 hours, missing his planned walk with Margaret. When he woke, groggy and stiff, he realized this wasn't just tiredness, it was a silent thief, robbing him of moments he could never get back. That evening, he confided in Margaret. "It's the meals," he said softly. "Some of them drain me dry. It's not just sleep, it's not just age, it's food." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with both concern and relief. "Then we know where to look," she said gently. For the first time, Jeffrey felt a glimmer of control. This wasn't inevitable decline, it was a puzzle, one he could solve. He began to track not only what he ate, but how his body responded afterward. Slowly, the patterns emerged. Meals heavy with reheated sauces, processed meats, or rich starches left him limp, his energy vanishing like smoke. But lighter, fresher meals, a bowl of oatmeal, a plate of steamed vegetables, a piece of fish, gave him steadier strength. The drain wasn't random, it had triggers, and the more he noticed them, the more power he had to prevent them. Still, the process wasn't easy. Old habits tugged at him. Sometimes convenience won out, and he reheated a dish he knew would leave him weary. When the drain returned, he felt the familiar frustration, the temptation to give up. But then he thought of Emma, running through the yard, calling, "Come play, Grandpa." He thought of Margaret waiting by the door for their evening walk, and he realized that energy wasn't just about him. It was about presence, being there for the people he loved. That gave him the strength to keep listening, to keep learning. One afternoon, Matthew stopped by and noticed the difference. "Dad, you've got more pep in your step lately," he remarked as they walked through the garden. Jeffrey chuckled. "Turns out I've been giving my energy away without realizing it. Some meals fill me, others drain me. I'm finally paying attention." Matthew looked at him with admiration. "Most people just accept being tired at your age, but you're not settling," Jeffrey smiled. "I've learned the cost is too high. I don't want to miss the time I have left." The change became clear in the smallest of ways. Jeffrey no longer needed long naps after lunch. He could climb the stairs without pausing halfway. He could sit through Emma's piano practice without drifting off. These victories, though quiet, filled him with pride. He felt as though he was reclaiming pieces of himself that fatigue had stolen, one careful meal at a time. Margaret celebrated the progress with him. She began preparing smaller, fresher meals, watching closely to see how Jeffrey responded. Together, they experimented, laughing at the trial and error, rejoicing in the discoveries. "It's like we're detectives," she joked one evening, stirring a pot of soup. Jeffrey laughed, but his eyes softened with gratitude. "Detectives chasing after life," he said. And that was exactly what it felt like. The lesson reached beyond food. Jeffrey began to see energy as a precious resource, one he could protect through choices, habits, even attitudes. He realized that saying yes to certain meals was saying no to moments with his family, and the reverse was true too. Saying no to the foods that drained him was saying yes to life. The thought gave him courage, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as he and Margaret walked beneath the stars, Jeffrey paused and said softly, "You know, I used to think being tired was just part of aging, but now I see it differently. Fatigue isn't who I am. It's what happens when I forget to care for myself." Margaret squeezed his hand. "And now you're remembering." He nodded, his heart swelling with quiet determination. That night, as he wrote in his notebook, Jeffrey summed up the lesson with a single phrase: energy is presence. He realized that fatigue wasn't just about how he felt. It was about what he lost when he let it rule him. The laughter, the walks, the shared stories, the living. And by guarding his energy, he was guarding the life he still had to live. As he closed the notebook and turned out the light, Jeffrey whispered to himself, "No more silent drains, not when there's so much life left to enjoy." And with that, he drifted into sleep, his body steady, his spirit calm, his energy no longer slipping quietly away. Independence had always been Jeffrey's pride. He was the one who fixed leaky faucets, carried groceries in both arms, and drove Margaret to the market on Saturdays without fail. Even in retirement, he prided himself on managing the small things, climbing the stairs without help, mowing the lawn at his own pace, tying his shoes without effort. But lately, independence felt fragile. Each time his body stiffened after the wrong meal, each time fatigue pinned him to his chair, he felt the shadow of dependence creeping closer. More than pain, more than discomfort, it was that loss of freedom that frightened him most. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. Jeffrey had reheated a plate of sausage and potatoes, comfort food that brought back memories of family dinners. Within an hour, his knees swelled, and by evening, climbing the stairs to bed was a slow, painful ordeal. He gripped the railing tightly, his body trembling with the effort. Margaret hovered nearby, her hand outstretched just in case he stumbled. When they finally reached the bedroom, Jeffrey sat on the edge of the bed, his chest heavy with more than physical pain. "If this keeps up," he whispered, "I won't be able to do it on my own anymore." Margaret sat beside him, her voice steady but tender. "Jeff, independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about making choices that let you keep living the way you want." Her words lingered long into the night. He realized she was right. Independence wasn't something that disappeared overnight. It was chipped away by choices, some small, some unnoticed. And if he wanted to hold on to it, he would need to choose differently. The next morning, instead of reheating leftovers, Jeffrey made himself a fresh omelet with spinach and tomatoes. The difference was immediate. His stomach felt calm, his joints didn't ache, and when it came time to climb the stairs, his legs carried him with surprising steadiness. It wasn't a miracle. The stiffness didn't vanish entirely, but it was enough to remind him that independence wasn't gone. It was still within reach, tied to the choices he made daily. That realization became his anchor. He began to view every meal not just as food, but as a vote for independence or for dependence. When he reached for lighter, fresher meals, he was voting for the ability to walk with Margaret, to kneel in the garden, to carry Emma in his arms without fear of stumbling. When he gave in to heavier, reheated dishes, he felt the opposite, the quiet erosion of his freedom. The pattern was clear, and the stakes were too high to ignore. One evening, Matthew visited and found Jeffrey in the garden, kneeling comfortably as he tended to the soil. "Dad, you're moving better these days," he remarked. Jeffrey smiled, brushing dirt from his hands. "I've realized something," he said. "Every choice I make at the table decides whether I keep doing this on my own. Food doesn't just feed me, it decides how free I stay." Matthew looked at him with admiration. "That's powerful, Dad. Most people never figure that out." Margaret supported him every step of the way. She began preparing meals with independence in mind, filling their plates with foods that left Jeffrey steady rather than sluggish. She reminded him gently when temptation called, her voice never scolding but always encouraging. Together, they turned the kitchen into a place of partnership, where each meal was crafted with care, each choice made with purpose. And as Jeffrey grew stronger, steadier, more confident, their bond deepened too. Still, the journey tested him. One afternoon, craving nostalgia, Jeffrey reheated a plate of creamy casserole. By evening, his legs felt heavy, his balance uncertain. As he reached for the railing, frustration welled up inside him, but instead of despair, he chose reflection. "I can't afford to forget," he told Margaret that night. "Every time I slip, I give away a little more of myself. I want to keep walking beside you, not leaning on you." She kissed his cheek softly. "And you will, Jeff, because you're learning." Over time, Jeffrey found new joy in his independence. He took pride in carrying grocery bags again, in walking the neighborhood without needing to pause, in playing with Emma without fear of falling. Each moment became a victory, proof that he was still capable, still free. Independence was no longer something he took for granted. It was something he fought for daily, with each choice he made. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Jeffrey and Margaret walked slowly down their street. The air was cool, the trees alive with the sound of crickets. Jeffrey paused, looking at Margaret with quiet conviction. "Do you know what I've realized?" he asked. "My independence isn't slipping away. It's tied to the choices I make. And as long as I keep choosing wisely, I can hold on to it." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "And I'll be here to remind you when you forget." That night, as Jeffrey wrote in his notebook, he penned the words that had become his guiding truth. Every choice at the table is a choice for freedom. He closed the notebook with a sense of peace, knowing that independence wasn't a gift taken from him by age. It was something he could protect moment by moment, choice by choice. As he drifted off to sleep, he whispered to himself, "I'm still free, and I plan to stay that way." Jeffrey thought he had learned most of the lessons his body had to teach him. He had discovered the foods that weighed him down, the ones that sharpened his mind, and even the small choices that helped him guard his independence. But life, he realized, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. That surprise came in the form of a food he had overlooked for years, something so ordinary, so unassuming, that he never imagined it could make a difference. It was Margaret who brought it home first. She had picked up a bag of lentils from the market, tucked between her usual groceries. "I thought we might try something new," she said cheerfully as she unpacked. Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. Lentils weren't part of his routine. They reminded him of college cafeterias and bland soups, nothing worth celebrating. "Do we really need those?" he asked, half joking. Margaret only smiled. "Just wait and see." A few days later, she served him a warm bowl of lentil stew, simmered with vegetables and spices. Jeffrey ate reluctantly at first, expecting little. But as the meal settled, he noticed something unexpected. There was no heaviness in his stomach, no aching in his joints, no fatigue that dragged him into his chair. Instead, he felt steady, energized, and clear. By evening, when Emma came to visit, he had enough vitality to chase her through the yard, laughing as she darted between the trees. Margaret watched from the porch, her smile full of quiet satisfaction. The next day, Jeffrey felt the same. His energy didn't dip as it usually did, his knees didn't swell, his mind stayed alert. "It's strange," he admitted to Margaret. "That simple bowl of stew left me stronger than I've felt in weeks." Margaret chuckled. "Sometimes the plainest things surprise us." He nodded thoughtfully, realizing how often he had dismissed the ordinary in search of comfort or tradition. Yet here was a humble food, quietly giving him back pieces of himself he thought were gone. The real surprise came when Matthew and his family joined them for dinner a week later. Margaret prepared a large pot of lentil stew, filling the house with its earthy aroma. At first, Matthew wrinkled his nose. "Lentils? Really, Mom?" But after a few spoonfuls, the whole table was humming with contentment. Even Emma declared it Grandpa's new magic soup. Jeffrey laughed, though deep inside he felt something profound. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the way it brought everyone together, nourishing not just their bodies, but their bond as a family. Over the following weeks, lentils became a regular part of their meals. Jeffrey noticed the difference each time. His digestion was smoother, his energy steadier, his joints calmer. He began to see the food not as bland or boring, but as a quiet ally. "I underestimated you," he said one evening, looking down at his bowl with a smile. "You're stronger than you look." Margaret teased, "Are you talking to the lentils or to me?" He laughed, but in truth, he felt gratitude for both. What surprised him most was the way this discovery reshaped his perspective. He realized that healing didn't always come from grand revelations or exotic solutions. Sometimes it came from the simplest, most overlooked places. The final food that surprised him wasn't flashy or indulgent. It was humble, steady, reliable, much like the life he was learning to live. And in that humility, he found strength. One evening, as he sat with Emma on the porch, she asked innocently, "Grandpa, why do you eat those lentils so much?" Jeffrey smiled, pulling her close. "Because they remind me that strength doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it comes in small, simple things." Emma nodded, though he knew she didn't fully understand. Still, he hoped the lesson would stay with her, that life's gifts often arrive in quiet packages. As the seasons turned, Jeffrey continued to choose meals that lifted rather than drained him. He no longer feared food the way he once had, no longer saw it as a betrayal. Instead, he saw it as a conversation, a partnership. Some foods asked more of him than he could give. Others gave back more than he expected. And among them, the humble lentil had become a symbol of surprise, of resilience, of the hidden healing that still waited to be found even in his 70s. One evening, as the family gathered around the table, Margaret placed the pot of stew in the center. Emma clapped her hands. "Grandpa's magic food." Everyone laughed, and Jeffrey felt his heart swell with gratitude. Looking around at the faces of those he loved, he realized the truth. The real surprise wasn't the lentils at all. It was the way his choices had given him back the moments he feared losing. The laughter, the games, the independence, the clarity. Later that night, as he wrote in his notebook, he penned the words that captured his journey. "Strength is found in the simple things, if you're willing to see them." He closed the book, his spirit full of peace. The final food hadn't just surprised his body, it had surprised his soul, reminding him that life, even in its later chapters, was still full of discovery. As he turned out the light and lay beside Margaret, he whispered, "Who would have thought lentils would teach me so much?" She smiled in the dark, squeezing his hand. Life has a way of surprising us when we listen. Jeffrey drifted to sleep with those words in his heart, knowing that his journey was not about endings, but about beginnings. Each one waiting quietly in the ordinary, ready to surprise him with new strength. Jeffrey's story began with something small, a plate of reheated food that left him heavy and foggy. At first, he brushed it off as age, but each ache, each wave of fatigue whispered that his body was trying to tell him something. He felt fear in those early days, afraid that he was losing himself, his independence, his sharpness of mind. But instead of giving up, Jeffrey chose to listen. Step by step, he discovered the patterns. Some foods drained him, while others, even simple ones like fresh oatmeal, gently warmed rice, or a handful of blueberries, gave him back clarity, energy, and peace. He learned that the safe meals of yesterday could quietly harm him today, and that gentleness in how he treated food often became gentleness in how he treated himself. Most of all, he realized that every choice at the table was also a choice for his freedom, his memory, and the moments he most treasured with his family. Jeffrey's journey reminds us that aging is not just about loss. It's about discovery, about noticing the signals our bodies give, about finding new allies in the foods we eat and the habits we build. His strength didn't come from resisting change, but from embracing it with humility and courage. And now I want you to remember this. The story isn't only Jeffrey's, it's yours too. Every day you have the chance to choose differently, to listen closely, to honor your body's wisdom. It's never too late to find the foods that heal, the habits that restore, and the choices that keep you strong and independent. Start with one small change today, because those small choices can write an entirely new chapter in the story of your life.